Welcome everybody to my live broadcast on Hangouts, live on YouTube here. In continuation with my radio series, I've been researching the history of radio station transmission in the United States, dating back to the 1920s, and came across an article from the National Endowment of the Humanities that I'd like to share with you. So I'm going to do a little screen share here and read you this incredible article. So let me just go over to my application window that I want to share. And here we go. So this article is written by Katy June-Friesen, and it's called "For a Brief Time in the 1930s, Radio Station WLW in Ohio became America's one and only superstation." This is incredible American history as far as radio stations go. And excuse me while I get my orientation about how to do this with Hangouts. I'm live right now. There's no editing involved. When President Franklin Roosevelt, sitting in the White House, pushed a ceremonial button on his desk in May 1934, a 500,000 watt, guys, 500 kilowatt. Now I gotta pause right there, because the current cap on AM and FM stations is 50 kilowatts or 50,000 watts. And the stations on shortwave that I'm receiving here in the Northeast out of Cuba are 250 kilowatts or 250,000 watts today. So in 1934 in the US, in a field outside Cincinnati, was double the transmitter output as these largest stations out of Cuba today, which reach northern New England. If that gives you a scale, I mean, to me, that's just amazing. So rows of 5-foot glass tubes warmed, because, you know, back then all amplification was through amplifier tubes before any transistors were around or anything like that. Water flowed around them at more than 600 gallons per minute just to cool them off. Dozens of engineers lit filaments and flipped switches, and within the hour, enough power to supply a town of 100,000 coursed through an 831-foot tower. Guys, 1934, pretty cool. Thus began WLW's 5-year, 24-hour-a-day experiment. A radio station that used more power and transmitted more miles than any station in the United States had or would. This was the end-all be-all in American history for radio transmission. The so-called superstation, licensed by the new Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, on a temporary basis amped up the debate among broadcasters, government regulators, and listeners about how radio should be delivered to serve the public interest, a mandate laid out in the Radio Act of 1927 and influenced legal, programming, and technical decisions that shaped the broadcast system we know today. Since radio's beginnings in the early 1920s, industry and government leaders promoted it as the great homogenizer, a cultural uplift project that could, among other things, help modernize and acculturate rural areas. The challenge was how to reach these areas, many of which received few or no radio signals in the mid-1930s. One solution was high-powered clear channel stations that could blanket large swaths of the country with a strong signal. These stations operated on cleared frequencies that the government assigned to only one station to prevent interference. The word monopoly comes to my mind reading that. WLW had operated on one of the 40 designated clear channels since 1928. The station's creator and owner, an entrepreneur, inventor, and manufacturer named Powell Crosley Jr., frequently increased the station's wattage as technology and regulation allowed. In 1934, when WLW increased power from 50 kilowatts to 500 kilowatts, all other clear channel stations were operating at 50 kilowatts or less. So, 50 kilowatts, guys, is 50,000 watts. So, that's the norm today for large stations. But that was on the lower end of the spectrum back in 1928. Now, WLW had the ability to reach most of the country. Guys, check that out. From Cincinnati, had the ability to reach most of the country, especially at night when AM waves interact differently with the Earth's ionosphere and become sky waves. People living near the transmitter site often got better reception than they wanted. Some lights would not turn off until WLW engineers helped rewire houses. Gutters rattled loose from buildings. A neon hotel sign near the transmitter never went dark. Farmers reported hearing WLW through their barbed wire fences. I mean, guys, how cool is that? This station, WLW, at 500 kilowatts or 500,000 watts, was so powerful that people's lights wouldn't turn off in their houses even after they cut the switch. And gutters rattled loose from houses. Talk about radiation. A neon sign in a hotel never went dark. But I mean, the best part is farmers reported hearing the station through their barbed wire fences. Can you just visualize the power of this kind of station? In the early days of broadcast development and regulation, Crosley and the WLW sparked debate about what a radio should and could be. Could a few clear channel stations adequately serve and acculturate entire regions of listeners, or would a national network system with local affiliates better target listeners' needs and interests? Of course, for most broadcasters and regulators, debating these broad delivery systems, listeners meant, okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. It's getting into like cultural stuff and political stuff. Let's see. WLW began in 1921 on a wooden breadboard. One day, my son visited a friend and came back home with a glowing description of a new wireless outfit, Crosley told a magazine in 1948. He agreed to buy his 9-year-old son a radio, but when Crosley discovered that the sets ran $100, he said that he was going to buy instructions and build his own for his 9-year-old son. Amateurs at the time used breadboards as a platform for wires, tubes, and other components of low-cost crystal radio sets. That's interesting because I still use what's called breadboards for electronics projects, but they're not breadboards the way you'd think as made out of wood. They have to do with little pinholes for positive or negative charges to easily demo different electronics projects or prototype. The more expensive pre-assembled radios used vacuum tubes and required battery power and had better reception. With plenty of money in the bank from his manufacturing business, Crosley, a curious, driven man whose employees alternately described him as aloof and one of the boys, could have afforded the $100 radio. Instead, he took the chance to learn about the new radio technology firsthand. As always, he was thinking about how he could make it better. Disappointed with the few poor quality offerings in his area, he finally ordered a 20-watt transmitter and started an amateur station in the living room of his Cincinnati mansion. Before I knew it, he recalled, I had literally forgotten my regular business in my intense interest in radio. It sounds like a guy following his passion, as probably many of you out there can relate to. He had made several failed attempts to produce a new automobile. Okay, this goes into his stuff with his company made furniture, cabinets, etc. I mean, this guy was an entrepreneur. He developed different businesses. But his instincts were right. In 1922, there were 60,000 radio sets in the United States. 1 year later, guys, in 1923, there were 1.5 million radio sets. I mean, we live in the age of cell phones, and, you know, many of us who are over the age of 50, 40, you know, we've watched that mature. But I mean, just check out the scale of this technology. If you can think back to analog radio and how influential that's been. In 1922, there were 60,000 radio sets. The next year, in 1923, guys, there were 1.5 million radio sets in American households. Wow. Wow. By 1935, 2/3 of all homes in the country had one. Man, talk about scaling up. Crosley played a big role in this surge. He was the first person to figure out how raw radio components could look better than a nest of wires. His manufacturing facilities included woodworking plant. He hired University of Cincinnati engineering students, incorporated production techniques like Henry Ford. So he pumped out crystal radio sets, wooden boxes with dials that were affordable for the masses. A little year after he wired his first breadboard, the Crosley Manufacturing Corporation, soon to be renamed Crosley Radio Corporation, was the world's largest maker of radio sets and parts. The company made little money, but by 1928, Crosley's profit was more than 3.6 million. Check out the radio here, man. And that is pretty cool looking, very modern. I mean, ironically, in 2019 right here, I mean, that thing looks very modern to me. It almost has the kind of aesthetics of like a Dr. Dre Beats headphones in a way. To me, that's just what comes to mind looking at that. It's almost like nothing changes, you know. Man, would I love to have one of those old Crosley radios, wouldn't you? But radios needed programming. Okay, getting into some stuff here as far as the just kind of I'm kind of scan ahead here. I want to get down to the legislation part. So let's see. Oh, the Federal Radio Commission was reorganizing the crowded broadcasting spectrum in 1927. You know, more people were getting in on the game. But WLW, being a huge player, was cleared for the 700 kilohertz frequency. The next year, the FRC, or Federal Radio Commission, greenlighted WLW to broadcast at 50 kilowatts from Mason, Ohio, 25 miles north of Cincinnati. It was one of the first stations to broadcast at this scale of power. The same it's the maximum allowed for AM stations today, by the way. I mentioned that before, 50 kilowatts. But we're talking 1927, guys. WLW began calling itself the nation's station. That's kind of presumptuous in a way, but it also invokes National Public Radio, right, guys? Please post your comments below about any of my commentary as I read along here. That's what this YouTube channel is all about. So Crosley applied for a license to experiment with 500 kilowatts in 1932. Regulators and the broadcasting industry thought WLW might pave the way for a series of clear channel mega stations that could provide better service to more people. Crosley hired RCA, General Electric, Westinghouse to build a first of its kind $500,000 transmitter that filled several buildings, included 3,600 foot square outdoor cooling pond. Remember, guys, because these were vacuum tubes used for amplification, and apparently these outdoor cooling ponds, you know, the water was used as a radiator really to cool the vacuum tubes. Very interesting. WLW was allowed to test high power between 1 a.m. and 6 a.m. And in May 1934, the station began broadcasting with its 500 kilowatt around the clock. Guys, 500 kilowatts around the clock. Again, that's double what Radio Habana, south of Habana, Cuba, broadcasts. And I can get that all the way in southern Maine. So, I mean, you can see the scale of the power here back in the 30s. So from the 30s to the 50s, the nation's clear channels dominated the radio world. All were owned by or affiliated with the rapidly expanding national networks. They brought in the most ad revenue, original content. Radio stars came from clear channel stations. They carried programs from NBC Red, NBC Blue networks, as well as CBS, etc. The Lone Ranger, programs I haven't heard of, WGN, Chicago's Lum and Abner. Let's see, just kind of scanning ahead here in the article. It launched the careers of many radio stars, WLW did, including Ma Perkins, Andy Williams. Well, I know Andy Williams. I mean, The Most Wonderful Time of the Year is one of my favorite Christmas songs. Rosemary and Betty Clooney, Red Skelton, and Fats Waller. Oh, Fats Waller ain't misbehaving. Jazz pianist. The station was known for its hillbilly and music and barn dance music, Midwestern hayride. Pretty cool, man. I'm gonna have to research some of this stuff on YouTube because I'm interested in hearing some of this stuff. I'm sure there's recordings of this. Agricultural programming. I mean, being in Ohio, of course, there would be a lot of agricultural interest in that area in the Midwest. Even started an on-site station-owned farm. Pretty cool. All right, scan ahead here. There's Crosley right there, a picture. Other clear stations we get to go with. Other clear stations would soon get the go-ahead for higher power, that 500 kilowatts, and fought to keep their frequencies from being duplicated elsewhere in the country. But WLW's power, economic and sonic, would be the downfall of the superpowered experiment. Yeah, because I'm thinking monopoly. I mean, there's Crosley right there. And it's kind of reminding me of the monopolies, you know, of the age of industrialization in the United States. So stations close to WLW on the frequency dial started complaining that the station was interfering with their signals. But it's, you see, as you can tell when you listen to radio sometimes, really powerful stations can bleed through to other stations that don't have as much transmitting power. And that's what the stations were complaining about. So its signal could cause problems for closely adjacent stations of channels hundreds of miles away. It doesn't surprise me. At the time of their frequency assignments, the stations would not have been powerful enough to broadcast across the same region. WLW had to build a directional antenna system to reduce its signal strength, you know, etc. So this, you can just see this is getting into a lot of controversy, basically. So the station WLW continued to operate at 500 kilowatts on temporary authority, renewable every 6 months. You can already see the writing on the wall here, guys, for FCC legislation. And in 1936, the Federal Communications Commission began hearings on whether to allow stations to permanently operate at that wattage. In preparation for the hearings, the FCC conducted a series of rural residents, a survey of rural residents, the population for whom clear channels were thought to be the most beneficial. Respondents in 13 states rated WLW as their top preferred station. Well, that seems to bode well for them. But after the first round of FCC hearings, 15 more stations applied to use the 500 kilowatt power threshold. Some had already started building facilities and new transmitters. However, regulators and non-clear channel broadcasters were beginning to think this was too much power. In 1938, the Senate passed a resolution recommending that the FCC cap station power at 50 kilowatts and voiced concern that superpower stations could deprive smaller stations of network affiliations and national advertising revenue. Follow the money, right? Well, for good reason. Local and regional stations who produced more locally focused programs complained that WLW was encroaching on their ability to sell on-air spots, which was essential to their survival. The head of a group representing local stations without network affiliation told the FCC that the local station has been in the position of Lazarus, dependent upon the crumbs from the table of Dives. Sounds like some Greek mythology right there. Concerned that clear channels and networks would monopolize. That's the first word. That's the first time I've seen the word monopoly in this article. And I agree. The airwaves continue to mount. Roosevelt, who had the dedication of, I'm gonna scan ahead here, guys, because we're getting up into a Senate hearing here. There's other backlashes to WLW's interfering with its broadcast as far as New Jersey, guys. WOR. I mean, remember, WLW is in Ohio, and New Jersey's WOR is complaining. So that gives you an idea of what 500 kilowatts is all about. I mean, I pick up stations that are broadcasting on 50 kilowatts from Chicago and Cleveland. And I'm in New England, 900 miles away. And that's in 2019. So you can only imagine the scale of this going on in the budding radio industry, which was just taking off exponentially. Remember, guys, there was no television back then in 1938, or internet, of course. I mean, radio was the thing. This was the means of communication, really. Well, that and the telegraph, of course, which was around for, oh gosh, I don't know, 70 years before that even. So I'm going to scan ahead here. In 1939, despite WLW's extensive testimony before the FCC and its insistence that cutting its power would cut service to people who otherwise had none, regulators decided not to renew WLW's authority to broadcast at 500 kilowatts. The station had to roll its power back to 50 kilowatts, which is still the norm today, guys. So these laws were implemented in 1939 that still hold today for AM and FM stations in the United States, which is still the maximum wattage allowed for AM clear channel stations. The Crosley Corporation eventually appealed to the Supreme Court, but was denied. Wow. So the station continued its programming schedule with power downgraded to ordinary levels. Crosley lost interest. Now, isn't that interesting? That, as long as he was the big cheese, it seems, he was very keen on developing his radio industry. But then when the Senate and FCC regulations were passed, he lost interest in his station. Kind of interesting. Was there some greed involved there on Crosley's part? I don't know. Weigh in the comment section if you've made it this far in the video. I know it's a long one, but for those of you who are interested in the topic, you're probably still with me. So his radios no longer dominated the market. He'd been manufacturing new inventions. The first refrigerator with shelves inside. Wow. So, I mean, Crosley wasn't missing a beat. This guy was highly adaptable and moved on to new technologies. Got to give him credit. Got to give him credit. His catalog of products would include Cool Rest, a bed cooler, and an air conditioner, Go BB, a baby car tricycle hybrid, a scalp massager to stimulate hair growth. Very, very interesting. Like the patent medicine era, And his true love was cars. Developed Crosley Motors. Pretty impressive guy, this Crosley. I gotta say. And he sold his auto company and retired from manufacturing. Died of a heart attack at age 74. So WLW continues to broadcast at 50 kilowatts on the AM band. Well, I got to check that out because I've been receiving stations from Cleveland, as mentioned on a previous video. I'll post a link here in the description. I've received a few stations from Cleveland, and as far as Chicago, I don't know if I've gotten WLW yet, though. But I'm going to be looking out for it. The station's once groundbreaking transmitter is long retired but preserved on site. Besides its modern counterpart, it still reaches the airwaves via the giant antenna Crosley installed in the 1930s. Well, thanks for staying with me for this video. Let me try to pop back here to my Hangouts window and see if I can stop screen sharing here. There we go. There I am, everybody. And I was just narrating that video, but I've been here the whole time. That is the beauty of Google Hangouts, live stream on YouTube. And I have been broadcasting this all live. For those of you who are getting into YouTube or live streaming, this actually goes in line with this article we just went over as far as radio and history and stuff like that, broadcasting live on YouTube with, no edits or anything, I'm actually using a Lapierre microphone right here, just a little clip-on mic. It adds a lot of quality to the audio broadcast versus using my onboard laptop internal microphone, which creates kind of that echoey effect from a distance of, I don't know, about 2 feet right there to the webcam and the microphone on my laptop. So, going over the history of the radio station in Cincinnati, broadcasting at that incredible 500,000 watts back in the 30s, and where we're at today in 2019, where we can broadcast right from our computers over an invisible Wi-Fi signal, which is an electromagnetic signal. It's a radio wave. It's pretty cool. And thanks for watching. If you enjoy radio technology or any history or want to add to the discussion, please post your comments below. Please give this video a thumb up and share it with your radio friends. And thanks for watching. Good night, everybody.